My name is Sloane, and at 32 years old, my own mother ruined my birthday dinner with a single devastating sentence. "Let me be honest," she announced to the entire private dining room. "We never loved you." The room went completely silent. I did not cry or scream. I simply stood up, smiled, and said thank you for the honesty. Then I walked out. The next morning, I woke up to 73 missed calls from my family. They were in a state of absolute panic. What they did not know was that the boring desk job they always mocked was actually a cover for my real career. I was the managing partner of a ruthless private equity firm, and I had just legally acquired all of their toxic debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent circles of Prince George County, Maryland, my family was absolutely obsessed with appearances. My father, Harrison, built a commercial real estate business from the ground up and carried himself like a king, demanding unquestioning loyalty from everyone around him. My mother, Vivian, treated her social status at the country club and elite charity galas as her true full-time job. They demanded perfection and traditional success from their children. My older sister, Aaliyah, played their game flawlessly. She ran a luxury public relations firm funded entirely by our father, and she never let anyone forget her status. I was always the quiet one, the analytical daughter, who preferred studying financial spreadsheets to attending high society events. Because I refused to play their social climbing games, they assumed I was just a low-level financial worker grinding away in a tiny cubicle. They had no idea I was quietly running a massive financial fund that specialized in liquidating bad assets. The night of my 32nd birthday was supposed to be a quiet family celebration. My parents had booked the private dining room at one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in Georgetown. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glowing light over the pristine white tablecloths, and the waitstaff moved silently through the room pouring incredibly expensive champagne. I wore a tailored black suit that cost more than my sister made in an entire month, but its understated design meant my family completely ignored it. They only respected loud, flashy wealth. I sat at the table hoping for just one evening of peace. I should have known better. We had barely finished our appetizers when my mother tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. I looked up expecting a brief birthday toast or at least a polite acknowledgement of the occasion. Instead, Vivian stood up and smoothed her silk designer dress with heavily manicured hands. She looked around at the guests, which included several high society friends she had invited without my permission. "I want to raise a glass to the real star of the family tonight," my mother began, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness she used exclusively for her society friends. "As you all know, Aaliyah was just named to the top 40 under 40 list for her incredible public relations empire. We are just so proud of how she upholds the family legacy." Aaliyah beamed from across the table, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. She raised her glass, accepting the praise and the applause from my mother's friends, while I sat there completely forgotten on my own birthday. My father, Harrison, nodded in stern approval, gesturing to the waiter to pour more champagne for his favorite daughter. Not a single person in that room looked at me. Not a single person said happy birthday. The dinner quickly devolved into an endless presentation of Aaliyah and her supposed business triumphs. Every conversation was carefully steered back to how amazing she was and how much money the family business was making. That is when Trent decided to join the conversation. Trent was Aaliyah's white husband, a man who fancied himself a tech visionary despite launching 3 consecutive startups that mysteriously failed within months. He lived entirely off my father's money, but carried himself with an insufferable superiority complex. He leaned across the expensive table, pointing his silver fork directly at me. "You know, Sloane, you really should take some notes from your sister," Trent said with a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. "Running a real business takes vision and massive risk. It is a lot different than just pushing papers at some boring corporate desk job. But hey, Someone has to do the safe, predictable work to pay for their little apartment, right? We cannot all be empire builders like your father and your sister. Aaliyah giggled loudly and rested her hand on Trent's arm, as if he had just delivered a profound piece of wisdom. My father chuckled softly in agreement, taking a slow sip of his wine. I looked at Trent's smug face and felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my career or try to explain my position. I simply took a slow sip of my martini and looked right into his eyes. I knew something he did not. I knew that his current tech startup was burning through cash and illegally washing money from my father's real estate company to stay afloat. I knew that the entire family empire they were currently bragging about was exactly $15 million in debt. And most importantly, I knew that my private equity firm had quietly purchased every single cent of that debt 3 months ago. I owned them. I let Trent enjoy his moment of perceived superiority. I let my mother continue to parade Aaliyah around the room like a prized trophy. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to appear wealthy that they could not see the executioner sitting right across the table. I just smiled and placed my glass back on the table, watching them celebrate a legacy that no longer belonged to them. The real birthday gift was not this dinner. It was the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, their entire fake empire would cease to exist. The main courses arrived in a flurry of silver domes and synchronized waiters placing plates of perfectly seared sea bass and filet mignon before us. I watched as my mother Vivian inspected her meal with a critical eye before taking a delicate bite. The conversation around the table remained stubbornly focused on Aaliyah and her public relations firm. My father, Harrison, dominated the discussion, boasting about the commercial spaces he was supposedly developing to expand her office. It was a masterclass in pure fiction. I knew for a fact that those commercial spaces were currently sitting empty, heavily mortgaged, and bleeding money. But in this room, surrounded by their wealthy church friends and country club associates, they acted like untouchable royalty. As dessert was being served, my mother tapped her glass a second time. The crystal ringing sharply through the room caused the polite chatter to immediately cease. Vivian stood up and smoothed her silk dress, looking directly at me for the first time all evening. My heart did not race. My palms were not sweating. I simply waited for the inevitable performance. "You know, Sloane?" My mother began, her voice dropping its artificial sweetness for something much colder and calculating. "Everyone keeps asking me why we do not talk about you more. They ask what you do and why you are so different from your sister." She paused, letting the uncomfortable silence stretch across the expensive table. Aaliyah sat back in her chair, a smug expression settling over her perfectly contoured face. "I think tonight is the perfect time to clear the air," Vivian continued. "You have always been the black sheep of this family. While Aaliyah builds our legacy and your father expands our empire, you sit in the shadows contributing absolutely nothing to our social standing. You refuse to attend the right events, you refuse to date the right men, and you refuse to carry the family name with any sort of pride." My father swirled the red wine in his glass, deliberately avoiding my eyes. His silence was a loud and clear validation of every cruel word she was speaking. The society friends shifted in their seats, eager to witness the family drama unfold, firsthand, but too polite to intervene. "So let me be honest," my mother said, her eyes narrowing with pure malice. "We never loved you, Sloane. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family." There it was. The fatal blow. The sentence designed to break me down and reduce me to a sobbing child, begging for their affection. For 32 years, they had used subtle manipulation and passive-aggressive comments to keep me in line. Tonight, they decided to drop the act completely and destroy me in public. I looked around the table. Aaliyah was practically glowing with satisfaction, enjoying my public execution. Trent let out a soft, arrogant chuckle as if he were watching a highly entertaining television show. My father finally looked up, meeting my gaze with cold indifference. They fully expected me to crumble. They expected me to run out of the restaurant in tears. Instead, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The invisible chains of obligation and seeking approval evaporated in an instant. I did not cry. I did not scream. I slowly placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. I looked at my mother and smiled. It was not a forced smile or a defensive smirk. It was the most genuine, radiant smile I had ever worn. "Thank you for the honesty, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly calm and melodic. "I have waited 32 years to hear that." Vivian blinked, her expression faltering for a fraction of a second. She had expected an argument or a breakdown, not gratitude. Before she could formulate a response, the head waiter approached the table carrying a black leather folder containing the bill, the total for the private room. The vintage champagne and the multi-course dinner was astronomical. He hesitated, unsure of who should receive the check. I reached out and took the folder. My father scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "You cannot afford that, Sloane," he muttered. "Do not play games. Just put it down and let the adults handle it." I ignored him, reaching into my designer bag. I pulled out a heavy metal Centurion Black American Express card and placed it onto the tray. The head waiter's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the invitation, only card that required millions in annual spending just to maintain. He bowed his head deeply and stepped away to process the payment without a single question. Aaliyah rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "Whose company card did you steal to pay for that?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "Your boss is going to fire you when he sees the statement." "I am my own boss." "Aaliyah," I replied softly. I stood from my chair and let the restaurant attendant assist me in putting on my bespoke cashmere coat. The fabric was flawless, imported directly from Italy. Trent leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs in a display of unearned confidence. "Carefully there, Sloane," he sneered. "Do not max out your little credit limit just to impress us. You still have rent to pay on your tiny apartment." I paused, adjusting my collar. I looked down at my white brother-in-law, taking in his cheap tailored suit and his desperate need to feel superior. "Do not worry about my credit limit, Trent," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "You should focus entirely on your own. By the way, this coat costs more than your entire tech startup generated in legitimate revenue last year." Trent turned bright red, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a comeback. My father slammed his hand on the table, demanding respect, but I was already turning my back on them. I walked toward the exit, the sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The restaurant staff bowed respectfully as I passed, treating me with the deference reserved for their most powerful clients. I stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool, crisp air of the Washington night. My personal chauffeur stepped out of the idling black Maybach, opening the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, taking a deep breath of pure, unadulterated freedom. The family I had tried to please for 3 decades was gone, and I did not miss them at all. I slept beautifully that night. My $5 million penthouse was quiet and secure, high above the city streets. My fiancé Julian wrapped his arm around me as we rested, completely undisturbed by the drama I had left behind in Georgetown. When the morning sun finally filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I stretched and reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen illuminated, revealing an absolute explosion of notifications. There were 73 missed calls and dozens of frantic text messages. They were from my father, my mother, Aaliyah, and even Trent. They were not calling to apologize for ruining my birthday. They were calling in a state of absolute unhinged panic. The financial slaughter had officially begun. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse overlooking the Potomac River, casting a warm golden glow over the imported hardwood floors. I stretched, pulling the high thread count sheets around me, and breathed in the scent of fresh espresso. My fiancé Julian walked into the master bedroom, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He wore a simple gray sweater and soft cotton pants, looking effortlessly handsome. Julian was a senior financial attorney, a man who understood the quiet power of true wealth and had been my anchor through the years of my family's emotional abuse. He handed me my coffee and sat on the edge of the bed, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice deep and grounding. You have quite the situation developing on your phone. I took a sip of the perfect espresso and picked up my device from the nightstand. The screen was practically glowing with an endless stream of notifications. 73 missed calls, dozens of text messages, voicemails piling up one after another. My mother Vivian had called 20 times alone. My father Harrison had left 5 voicemails, a rarity for a man who believed leaving a message was beneath his dignity. Aaliyah and Trent had bombarded my inbox with frantic texts. They were not calling to apologize for ruining my 32nd birthday. They were not calling to express regret for telling me they never loved me in front of half of Georgetown. They were calling because the postman had just delivered their reality check. Julian tapped his iPad screen and slid it onto the bed in front of me. "The certified mail receipts just updated," he said calmly. "The foreclosure notices and default judgments were successfully delivered to your father's corporate office, your mother's mansion, and your sister's PR firm at exactly 8 a.m. I looked at the delivery confirmations and felt a profound sense of peace. It was time to reveal the truth about my boring desk job. For the past 5 years, my family assumed I was a low-level analyst, pushing papers in a cramped cubicle trying to scrape by. They mocked my modest wardrobe choices when I visited them, and my refusal to flaunt designer labels on social media. What they failed to understand was that real wealth whispers, while fake wealth screams. I was not an analyst. I was the managing partner of an aggressive private equity firm based in Washington, D.C. My specialty was acquiring toxic debt, restructuring failing companies, and liquidating assets. I commanded a room of seasoned Wall Street veterans and managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And my father Harrison was my latest acquisition, his commercial real estate empire, the one he bragged about at every country club dinner and church gathering, was a complete illusion. For the past 2 years, his company had been bleeding cash. The commercial spaces he claimed to be developing were actually empty, heavily mortgaged, and plagued with astronomical maintenance costs. To keep up the facade of black elite excellence, my father had taken out predatory loans from a shadow lending group. He used that toxic money to fund my mother, Vivian's extravagant shopping sprees and lavish charity galas. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into Aaliyah's luxury public relations firm, which operated at a massive loss, just so she could pretend to be a successful girl boss on Instagram. He even threw money at Trent's endless string of doomed tech startups to keep his white son-in-law feeling superior and important. They were living on borrowed time and borrowed money. Exactly 3 months ago, the lending group was looking to offload his high-risk portfolio. My firm stepped in. I spent weeks personally reviewing the ledgers, the outstanding loans, the defaulted covenants, and the collateral agreements. Seeing my own family's names on those delinquent accounts did not break my heart. It only confirmed what I had always known about their hypocrisy. I authorized the purchase of Harrison's entire $15 million toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. The moment the ink dried on those contracts, I became the legal owner of their entire existence. I owned the mortgage on my parents' massive estate in Maryland. I held the lien on the office building where Aaliyah ran her fake PR empire. I was their sole creditor. They had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant. They had drained my college fund years ago to pay for Aaliyah's first failed business venture, forcing me to work 3 jobs to pay for my own education. They told me I was a disappointment because I did not fit their shallow mold of success, all while they were secretly drowning in a $15 million ocean of debt. I clicked on the first voicemail from my father. The audio played softly in the quiet luxury of my bedroom. Sloan picked up the phone. His voice was tight, lacking its usual booming authority. "There has been a massive mistake with the bank. Some predatory equity firm bought our paper and they are freezing the corporate accounts. I need you to look into this using whatever low-level access you have at your firm. Call me back immediately." I deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. He still thought I was a secretary. He still thought he could command me to fix his messes while simultaneously looking down on me. The next voicemail was from my mother. She sounded absolutely unhinged. Her usual composed country club persona was completely gone. "Sloane, what is happening?" she shrieked into the phone. "Men in suits just showed up at the house with legal papers. They are saying the property is being seized. Tell your father to fix this. Call Aaliyah. Do something." Julian watched me delete that voicemail as well. He leaned over and kissed my forehead. "You built your empire from nothing," he murmured against my skin. "They built theirs on lies and stolen money. It is just business now." "It is exactly just business," I replied, setting the phone face down on the nightstand. My family loved to say that blood is thicker than water, but they treated my blood like it was poison. When my mother looked me in the eyes last night and told me they never loved me, she gave me the greatest gift I could ever ask for. She gave me permission to treat them not as family but as a non-performing asset, and in my line of work, non-performing assets get liquidated. I stood up from the bed and walked over to my massive walk-in closet. Today was a work day, and I needed to dress for the occasion. I bypassed the simple black suits I usually wore around them to avoid their judgmental comments. Instead, I selected a sharp tailored olive green blazer and matching trousers. I slipped on a pair of designer heels that commanded respect with every step. I was going to the office today, not as the disappointing daughter, but as the executioner of their fake empire. As I finished getting dressed, my phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Aalia's name. The golden child was finally reaching out directly. I knew exactly what this call would be about. It would not be an apology for her smug laughter at the restaurant last night. It would be a demand. She was about to realize that the safety net she had relied on her entire life had just been violently ripped away. I picked up the phone, swiped to answer, and pressed it to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited for the panic to spill over the line. "Sloane! What the hell is going on?" Aalia screamed through the speaker, her voice shrill and completely stripped of its usual polished public relations tone. "There are men in cheap suits taping notices to the glass doors of my agency. They are telling my staff to pack up their desks. You need to fix this right now." I walked over to the kitchen island and poured myself another cup of coffee. I watched the steam rise from the dark liquid, letting her frantic breathing fill the silence of my penthouse. I did not rush to answer her. I wanted her to sit in that panic for just a few seconds longer. "Fix what, Aalia?" I asked, my tone completely flat and devoid of any sisterly affection. "Do not play dumb with me, Sloane," she snapped, her breathing ragged and heavy. "The papers have your firm's name on them. Capital Vanguard Partners, or whatever your boring little company is called. Dad said your company bought our building loans, and now they are locking me out of my own office. I have a massive launch party for a celebrity client next week. I have caterers and photographers booked. You need to march into your manager's office right this second and tell him to rip up these eviction notices. Tell your boss it is a massive mistake and that we are good for the money." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. It was almost comical how deeply ingrained her entitlement was. Even while her entire world was collapsing around her, she still spoke to me like I was an intern who existed solely to serve her needs. She genuinely believed I was just a paper pusher in a cubicle who could beg a supervisor for a favor to save her skin. She thought she could command me just like she did when we were children. "You mean the office space Dad paid for?" I asked smoothly, walking toward the massive windows of my living room. The same office space he financed by quietly emptying my college trust fund 6 years ago. Aalia scoffed, a sound of pure irritation and disgust. "Oh my God, are you really bringing that up now? We are facing a family crisis, and you are whining about some ancient history tuition money. Dad made a strategic investment in my potential because I actually had a vision for this family. You were just going to waste that money on some useless degree and sit in a cubicle anyway. You owe this family, Sloane. We put a roof over your head. You are being incredibly selfish right now." "You put a roof over your head?" "Aalia," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And you used my stolen future to do it. You stood by and watched Dad drain the only safety net I had so you could play CEO on Instagram. You watched me work 3 miserable jobs just to pay for my own textbooks and ride the bus in the freezing cold while you were hosting champagne brunches on my dime. You bought designer bags and leased imported cars with money that was meant for my education. And last night you sat at that beautiful table in Georgetown and smiled while Mom told me I was utterly unloved. You enjoyed every single second of my humiliation. That was just Mom's way of pushing you to be better, Aaliyah stammered, trying to backpedal but failing miserably. You know how she is. You are being so dramatic and vindictive right now. Just go to your boss, Sloan. Get on your knees and beg if you have to. If my agency goes under, we lose everything. My reputation will be ruined in the district. I will be a laughingstock at the country club. I looked down at the tiny cars moving along the streets below my penthouse, completely detached from her suffering. My reputation is doing just fine, Aaliyah. And as for my boss, there is no one for me to beg. Because I am the boss. I am the managing partner of Capital Vanguard. I am the one who personally reviewed your dismal profit margins and fake client lists. I am the one who authorized the purchase of your toxic debt. And I am the one who signed the foreclosure notice currently taped to your glass doors. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. I could almost hear her brain short-circuiting as the reality of my words crashed into her fragile ego. The boring sister she had mocked her entire life, the woman she thought was beneath her, was actually the architect of her total destruction. All the lies they had told themselves about my failure were completely shattered. Business is business, Aaliyah, I said, my voice a whisper of pure ice. And unfortunately for you, your business is entirely bankrupt. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate my property before my security team physically removes you from the premises. Do not try to take any of the staging furniture or the electronics, because I own those too. Have a wonderful day. I ended the call before she could start screaming again. I tossed the phone onto the plush sofa and turned to Julian, who was watching me with an expression of deep respect and admiration. It was done. The first domino had fallen, and the rest of their fake empire was about to collapse right behind it. Watching Aaliyah lose her fake status was deeply satisfying, but I knew the fallout was far from over. Aaliyah was a coward when cornered. She would cry and play the victim, hoping someone else would fix her mess. But her husband Trent was a completely different story. Trent possessed the highly dangerous combination of total incompetence and blinding white male audacity. He was a man who had failed at every business venture he ever attempted, but still believed he was the smartest person in any room. He believed he could bully his way out of any situation, especially when dealing with a black woman he viewed as inferior and submissive. As I gathered my leather briefcase and headed toward my private elevator, I knew exactly what was coming next. Trent was not going to accept defeat gracefully. He was going to try and teach me a lesson about respect and hierarchy. He was going to try and put me back in my place. And he was going to walk right into the slaughterhouse to do it. I arrived at the sleek glass and steel high-rise that housed Capital Vanguard Partners in downtown Washington, D.C. The valet took the keys to my car, and I walked through the revolving doors, feeling the familiar rush of power that this building always gave me. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture with soaring ceilings and imported marble floors. I swiped my executive badge at the private elevator bank, heading up to the top floor where my corner office waited. I had barely settled into my ergonomic leather chair and opened my laptop to review the morning markets when my desk phone buzzed. It was Marcus, the head of building security. "Mrs. Sloan," he said, his voice professional but carrying a hint of irritation. "There is a gentleman in the lobby demanding to see you. He is making quite a scene and refusing to leave until you come down. He claims to be family." I did not have to ask for a name. I already knew exactly who it was. Aaliyah had undoubtedly called her husband the moment our phone call ended, crying about the eviction notices. Trent had driven straight here, fueled by his unearned confidence and desperate need to be the hero of the family that funded his lifestyle. "Keep him down there, Marcus," I instructed smoothly. "Do not let him pass the security turnstiles. I will be right down to handle it personally." I took the private elevator back down to the ground floor, adjusting my tailored olive green blazer. As the doors slid open, I heard his voice before I even saw him. He was practically shouting at the receptionist. "I demand you page her immediately," Trent barked, leaning aggressively over the marble reception desk. His face was flushed, and he was wearing his signature tech bro uniform, consisting of a quarter-zip fleece vest over a wrinkled button-down shirt. "You clearly do not understand who you are dealing with. Her father is Harrison, and I am her brother-in-law. Just get her down here so we can sort out whatever clerical error her department made with our accounts." I walked across the lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. The sound drew his attention. Trent spun around, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. He did not see a powerful executive. His deeply ingrained bias only allowed him to see the disappointing sister-in-law who was somehow causing problems for his easy life. "Sloane, finally," he sighed loudly, crossing his arms and shaking his head. "What kind of amateur operation are you running here? Your little department sent eviction notices to Aalia's agency and foreclosure papers to Harrison. You need to go back upstairs to whatever mid-level manager you report to and tell them they made a massive administrative error. My father-in-law is a giant in real estate. Your company is going to face a massive lawsuit for this harassment." I stopped a few feet away from him, clasping my hands loosely in front of me. The security guards subtly shifted closer, ready to intervene, but I gave them a slight nod to stand back. I wanted to let Trent dig his grave as deep as possible. Trent took a step closer, towering over me and dropping his voice into a condescending whisper. "Look, Sloane, I know you are probably scared of losing your little desk job, but you need to fix this. Harrison has been funding your entire life. Well, maybe not yours since you dropped out and ran away, but he is the backbone of this family. You saw that black Amex you threw around last night. I do not know whose name is really on that card or what kind of debt you are drowning in to pretend you are wealthy, but we need that credit right now." He actually reached out and snapped his fingers in front of my face as if trying to wake me up. "You need to take out a cash advance on whatever credit cards you have." Trent demanded, his tone morphing from irritated to commanding. "You need to take out a personal loan against your apartment. Harrison has some liquidity issues right now because of the current market climate. It is standard real estate stuff. You probably would not understand the complex financial mechanics of it. But he needs capital today to satisfy these predatory lenders your company works for." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words hang in the air between us. He genuinely believed I was going to ruin my own credit and plunge myself into debt to save a man who had publicly disowned me. He thought his position as the white savior of our black family gave him the authority to dictate my financial ruin. "You are going to walk over to a bank and pull out at least $200,000. Trent continued, oblivious to my total lack of reaction. "We can use that to hold off your aggressive collection department until Harrison moves some assets around." "Aaliyah is in tears, Sloane. Her entire launch party is ruined because of your incompetence. This is your chance to finally be useful to this family. You are going to show some loyalty for once in your life and bail us out. If you do this right, I will even put in a good word for you with Harrison. Maybe he will finally forgive you for being such a massive disappointment." The absolute delusion radiating from him was intoxicating. He stood there in the lobby of a building I practically owned, trying to explain high-level finance to the woman who literally held the deed to his entire existence. He was trying to leverage family loyalty, a concept they had weaponized and destroyed years ago, to manipulate me into funding his luxurious lifestyle. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or break eye contact with the man standing in my lobby attempting to lecture me about assets and liquidity. I simply let a cold smile touch my lips before I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen, waking it up, and pulled up a highly classified encrypted file that my forensic accounting team had finalized late last night. Trent crossed his arms, tapping his expensive leather shoe against the marble floor, waiting for me to apologize and hand over my personal credit cards. Instead, I calmly turned the screen of my tablet toward him. I watched his eyes dart down to the display. Initially, his expression remained arrogant, but as his eyes scanned the headers of the documents, his face went entirely slack. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority. "That Trent is the entire financial footprint of your latest tech startup," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "The one you claim is on the verge of disrupting the digital market. My analysts have spent the past 72 hours tracing every single dollar that has flowed into your operating accounts over the last 3 years. You see, when I purchased my father's $15 million debt portfolio, I gained access to his complete financial history. And what I found was a fascinating network of shell companies and fake vendor invoices." Trent uncrossed his arms. His pale skin began to turn a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "It appears that your brilliant tech company has zero actual clients." I continued, taking a single step closer to him. "But it does have millions of dollars in revenue. Revenue that strangely matches the exact amounts my father illegally siphoned out of his commercial properties before defaulting on his mortgages. You have been creating fake software licensing invoices to wash Harrison's dirty money. You are hiding his assets from his creditors and taking a generous management fee off the top to fund your luxury cars and Aaliyah's designer wardrobe." Trent stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. The confidence that had radiated from him just moments ago evaporated completely. "That is a lie." He stammered, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You fabricated these numbers. You are just a bitter dropout trying to ruin your sister's life because you are jealous." I slowly scrolled to the next page on the screen, displaying his personal banking routing numbers and the exact timestamps of the wire transfers. "I am not a dropout, Trent," I said softly. "And I am certainly not an analyst working in a cubicle. I am the managing partner of Capital Vanguard. This building belongs to my firm. The security guards standing behind you work for me. And as of this morning, I own every single asset your father-in-law has ever touched. Your entire lifestyle was built on fraud, and I have the receipts." He looked around the grand lobby, suddenly realizing how small he was in this environment. The security guards were watching him closely, waiting for my command. His eyes darted back to the tablet, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "That constitutes federal money laundering," I explained, enjoying the absolute terror washing over his features. "Wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. It carries a minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. The IRS and the FBI love cases like this because the paper trail is incredibly sloppy. You and Harrison did not even try to hide the digital footprints." "Please, Sloane," Trent whispered, his voice cracking. His hands were trembling now. "You cannot do this. Aaliyah does not know anything about the money. She thinks the startup is legitimate. If you expose this, you will destroy the whole family." "I already told you," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure ice. "We are not family. We are just creditor and debtor. And right now you are a massive liability." I tapped the screen again, pulling up a drafted email, addressed to the White Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The file containing his complete financial ruin was attached. My finger hovered over the send button. "I am going to give you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of my building," I told him. "If you ever speak to me again, if you ever approach me in public, if you ever try to contact me through my firm, I will hit send and watch the federal government seize your entire life." Trent stared at my finger hovering over the screen. He was completely broken. 10. I started counting, my voice echoing in the quiet lobby. 9. 8. He did not wait for 7. Trent spun around, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes, and sprinted toward the revolving doors. He pushed through the glass with frantic energy, fleeing the building as if the walls were collapsing around him. I watched him stumble out onto the busy Washington street, looking over his shoulder in pure panic, before disappearing into the morning crowd. I stood in the lobby for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Marcus, the head of security, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Do you need us to ban him from the premises, Mrs. Sloane?" he asked respectfully. "Yes, Marcus," I replied, sliding my tablet back into my blazer. "Add him to the restricted list. And if any other members of the Wilson family show up, you have my authorization to have them escorted off the property by local law enforcement." I turned and walked back toward my private elevator, the click of my heels ringing out with absolute authority. Crushing Trent was barely the appetizer. The main event was still to come, and I knew exactly how they would react next. They would not surrender quietly. They would resort to the only tactic they had left. They would try to destroy my reputation in the court of public opinion. But I was already 10 steps ahead of them, preparing the ultimate public execution for the Golden Child and the matriarch who had started it all. The digital assault began exactly 24 hours later. Aaliyah, being a supposed public relations expert, knew exactly how to spin a narrative for maximum emotional impact. She and my mother Vivian decided that since they could not bully me in private, they would destroy me in public. I sat in my office drinking my morning matcha, while Julian monitored the situation on his tablet. He silently turned the screen toward me so I could see the latest post. It was a highly produced Instagram live video. My mother and sister sat side by side on a plush velvet sofa in what looked like Vivian's formal sitting room. They were both dressed in muted, neutral tones, looking deliberately exhausted and fragile. Aaliyah's makeup was done to look tear-stained. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "It breaks my heart to share this with our community," Vivian said to the camera, her voice trembling with practiced grief. "We have always raised our daughters to honor family and protect our shared legacy. But sometimes the world changes people. Our youngest, Sloane, has turned her back on us. She has allowed greed to poison her heart and is actively trying to destroy the generational wealth our family has worked so hard to build." Aaliyah chimed in, wiping away a non-existent tear. She spoke directly to her thousands of followers. "My sister has used deceptive corporate tactics to target our family businesses. She is attempting to evict me from my agency and foreclose on our parents' home. We gave her everything. We paid for her education and supported her dreams, and this is how she repays us. Please pray for her soul and pray for our family during this devastating betrayal." The video was a masterclass in manipulation. They expertly weaponized the language of the Black elite community, appealing to concepts of legacy, generational wealth, and church values. They painted themselves as the innocent victims of a ruthless corporate monster who had forgotten her roots. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. My phone began to vibrate constantly with direct messages and texts from people I had not spoken to in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and country club acquaintances flooded my inbox with pure vitriol. "How could you do this to your own mother?" One church elder messaged me. "You are an absolute disgrace to our community," typed a woman who used to attend Vivian's charity galas. "You should be ashamed of yourself for trying to tear down another Black woman," wrote one of Aaliyah's fake industry friends. The narrative was spreading like wildfire. They were dragging my name through the mud, portraying me as a vindictive, ungrateful child who was tearing apart a prominent family for pure greed. They wanted to publicly shame me into submission. They thought that the pressure of social ostracization would break me. They assumed I would panic, delete the foreclosure notices, and beg for their forgiveness to restore my reputation. Julian watched the comments roll in his jaw tight with anger. "We can release the financial records," he suggested quietly. One press release showing Harrison's massive debt and the money laundering evidence would shut them up instantly. "My PR team can have it drafted in 10 minutes. I looked at the screen, watching my mother dab her perfectly dry eyes one more time. I slowly shook my head. "No," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "Let them talk. Let them rally the entire community to their side. Let them gather all their friends and supporters into one massive echo chamber." Julian looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face as he realized what I was doing. You are letting them climb higher, so the fall is completely fatal, he noted. Exactly, I replied. If we argue with them on the internet, it just becomes a messy family feud. It becomes a reality show drama. I am not going to fight with them in the comments section. Absolute silence is much more terrifying, so I did not post a single defense. I did not release a statement. I locked my personal social media accounts and instructed my firm's public relations department to ignore all inquiries. The silence from my end only made Vivian and Aaliyah bolder. Feeling victorious, they began posting daily updates about their resilience and their faith. They were soaking up the sympathy and using the manufactured crisis to boost Aaliyah's social media engagement. They genuinely believed they were winning. They thought my silence was a sign of weakness or cowardice. They thought the elite society of Washington, D.C. had successfully bullied me back into my place. What they did not know was that while they were busy recording tearful videos and reading supportive comments, I was sitting in a conference room with 3 senior litigation attorneys. We were not drafting social media posts. We were drafting subpoenas. I knew Aaliyah had a massive luxury relaunch party planned for her public relations firm at the end of the week. She had invited local politicians, minor celebrities, and every major influencer in the district. I also knew that my mother was hosting her highly anticipated seasonal brunch at the most exclusive country club in Maryland on that exact same day. They were planning to use these events to solidify their victim narrative and bask in the support of their wealthy peers. They wanted a public audience. I was going to give them a public execution. I instructed my legal team to coordinate with private process servers. We were not going to mail the legal documents or deliver them quietly to their homes. We were going to serve them in person right in the middle of their respective events. While they were busy playing the victims on the internet, I was preparing a devastating real-world strike that would shatter their illusions of safety and expose their financial ruin to the exact people they were trying to impress. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. Saturday arrived with a crisp breeze that swept through the capital, perfectly matching the cold precision of my plan. Julian and I sat in my penthouse living room with 2 large monitors set up on the glass coffee table. We were not physically attending either event, but in the modern age of social media, we did not have to. We had front row seats to the destruction we had orchestrated. My mother Vivian was hosting her highly anticipated seasonal brunch at the Rolling Hills Country Club in Maryland. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of church elders, politicians' wives, and local socialites. She had booked the grand terrace overlooking the golf course. According to the live updates on Instagram, she was wearing a pale pink designer suit and holding court at the head of the table. She was actively playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch, dabbing her eyes while sipping expensive mimosas and absorbing the sympathy of the Black elite. At the exact same time across the city in downtown Washington, my sister Aaliyah was hosting the luxury relaunch party for her public relations firm. The irony of throwing a lavish party in an office space she had not paid rent on in 4 months was not lost on me. She had hired a string quartet catering staff carrying silver trays of caviar and a professional photography team. She stood in front of a massive floral wall, giving interviews to local lifestyle bloggers about her resilience in the face of family betrayal. What neither of them knew was that I had hired an elite private security and process serving firm. I paid a premium to ensure my process servers did not look like typical couriers in cheap windbreakers. They were dressed impeccably, blending seamlessly into the wealthy crowds. We watched Vivian's downfall first through a live stream posted by one of her country club associates. The camera was focused on my mother as she gave a tearful speech about how money changes people and how she only prayed for my salvation. Just as she raised her glass to toast to family loyalty, a tall man in a tailored navy suit approached her table. He moved with such quiet authority that the women around my mother simply assumed he was the club manager. "Excuse me, are you Vivian?" The man asked, his voice polite but carrying enough volume that the surrounding tables grew quiet. My mother smiled her perfect society smile, assuming he was a guest coming to offer his condolences. "Yes, I am Vivian," she replied graciously. The man smoothly pulled a thick legal envelope from his breast pocket and placed it directly onto her fine china plate right on top of her imported brioche. You have been served, he said with absolute professional detachment. These are subpoenas for asset seizure and mandatory depositions regarding federal financial fraud. Have a pleasant afternoon. The man turned and walked away before my mother could even process the words. The live stream captured the exact moment her polite smile shattered into a mask of pure horror. Her trembling hands picked up the envelope displaying the bold red legal seals to the entire table of gossiping socialites. The woman filming the live stream gasped audibly, and the video abruptly ended, but the damage was permanently done. My mother had just been served papers for financial fraud in front of the exact women she had spent decades trying to impress. Her carefully constructed reputation evaporated in a matter of seconds. Julian poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed me one, just as Aalia's event descended into chaos. We switched our attention to the second monitor, tracking the social media tags for Aalia's public relations firm. She was standing on a small elevated platform in the center of her rented office, holding a microphone. She was in the middle of a speech about Black female entrepreneurship and overcoming obstacles. The room was packed with influencers holding up their phones recording every word. My second process server, a woman dressed in a sleek designer dress, stepped out from the crowd and walked directly up to the platform. She did not wait for Aaliyah to finish speaking. She simply reached up and handed Aaliyah a massive stack of bound legal documents. Aaliyah stopped talking, staring at the woman in confusion. She leaned away from the microphone, but the room was so quiet that the process server's voice carried clearly to everyone present. Aaliyah, you are hereby served with a commercial eviction notice and a federal subpoena for corporate money laundering, the woman announced loudly. You have 48 hours to vacate these premises before law enforcement changes the locks. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Dozens of smartphones were recording the exact moment the golden child was exposed as a complete fraud. Aaliyah dropped the microphone. The harsh feedback squeal echoed through the room as the heavy legal documents slipped from her hands and crashed onto the floor. The papers spilled open, revealing the eviction notices and banking records to the front row of guests. The influencers in the room did exactly what influencers do. They did not offer sympathy. They zoomed in. They captured her panicked face, the scattered legal documents, and the awkward silence that suffocated the room. Within minutes, the videos were uploaded to every major social platform. The hashtags that Aaliyah had created to promote her business were instantly hijacked by footage of her public humiliation. I leaned back against the plush cushions of my sofa, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The execution had been flawless. They wanted to use the public to shame me into submission. They thought their social standing was an impenetrable shield. I simply turned their weapon against them. They had gathered all their peers and colleagues into 2 convenient locations just to watch their fake empire crumble in real time. My phone began to vibrate on the glass table. It was not the angry hate messages from church elders anymore. The people who had been messaging me yesterday to call me a disgrace were now frantically deleting their comments and sending apologies, realizing they had publicly sided with criminals. The community that Vivian and Aaliyah had relied on to destroy me was rapidly distancing itself to avoid being associated with a federal fraud investigation. They were completely isolated now. Stripped of their fake wealth, their social currency, and their devoted followers, they had nowhere left to hide, and no one left to manipulate. The stage was perfectly set for the final phase of my plan. Harrison the patriarch, who had enabled all of this, was about to realize that his arrogant maneuvering had finally run out of runway. He was going to try to negotiate thinking he still held some kind of power. He was about to schedule a meeting with the faceless board of the equity firm that owned him, and I was going to be waiting for him right at the head of the table. Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour washing over the streets of Washington, D.C., but inside the executive suite of Capital Vanguard Partners, the atmosphere was crisp and controlled. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final preparation documents my legal team had assembled over the weekend. My assistant knocked softly and entered my office, placing a fresh matcha latte on my desk. She smiled professionally and informed me that Harrison and his legal counsel had just arrived in the lobby. Harrison had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to stop the bleeding. After his wife and golden child were publicly humiliated, he realized that social media campaigns and church gossip were entirely useless against federal subpoenas and corporate foreclosure notices. His back was firmly pressed against the wall, but instead of humbling himself, he doubled down on his arrogance. He assumed that Capital Vanguard Partners was just another faceless private equity firm run by a group of wealthy white men that he could charm, intimidate, or bribe into giving him an extension. He had demanded an emergency meeting with the board of directors, entirely unaware that the board was a singular entity, and that entity was the daughter he had disowned. I watched the live feed from the lobby's security cameras on my secondary monitor. Harrison strode through the revolving glass doors, wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that projected an image of untouchable wealth. He walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he owned the city completely, ignoring the reality that his entire portfolio was currently in my possession. His lead attorney, a seasoned corporate shark named Richard, followed closely behind him, clutching a thick leather briefcase. They approached the reception desk, and Harrison leaned heavily against the marble counter. I could not hear the audio, but his body language screamed entitlement. He was probably dropping names of local politicians and demanding immediate access to the managing partners. He thought he was walking into a standard negotiation where he could leverage his decades of experience in commercial real estate to restructure his toxic debt. He planned to use industry jargon, offer a small fraction of what he owed as a gesture of good faith and promise future returns that did not actually exist. My assistant buzzed my intercom. She kept her voice perfectly neutral as she announced that Mr. Harrison was demanding to speak with the head of the acquisitions department immediately. He specifically requested the senior partner in charge of the Mid-Atlantic portfolio. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my matcha. Put them in conference room A, I instructed her. Offer them sparkling water and tell them the managing partner will be with them shortly. Let them wait for exactly 15 minutes. I wanted Harrison to sit in that glass-walled room and absorb the sheer magnitude of the firm that held his fate. Conference room A was our most intimidating space. It was located on the top floor, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the Capitol. The table was a massive slab of polished black marble surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather chairs. It was designed to make visiting executives feel small and insignificant before negotiations even began. Julian walked into my office, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the security feed on my monitor, watching Harrison and his lawyer being escorted to the elevators. Julian shook his head, a low chuckle escaping his lips. He really has no idea what is about to happen, Julian murmured. He is walking into a slaughterhouse thinking he is the butcher. He genuinely believes his charm and his golf course connections are going to save him, I replied, standing up and smoothing down the lapels of my tailored white suit. He thinks because he has survived previous market downturns by moving money around in the dark that he can outsmart a private equity firm. He is going to walk into that room and try to play the elder statesman. He will try to patronize the board with stories about how he helped build this city. Julian stepped aside, holding the door open for me. Are you ready to show him exactly who built this firm? He asked, his eyes shining with pride. I picked up the single red folder containing the absolute liquidation of Harrison's empire. The folder held the bankruptcy filings, the asset seizure authorizations, and the federal money laundering reports, tying his accounts to Trent's fraudulent startup. It was a collection of paper that represented the end of his arrogant reign. I have been ready for 32 years, I said, my voice echoing with absolute certainty. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward conference room A. The sound of my heels was the only noise cutting through the silent executive floor. Through the frosted glass walls, I could see the silhouettes of the two men sitting at the far end of the massive table. Harrison was checking his expensive watch, tapping his fingers impatiently against the marble surface. His lawyer was reviewing a stack of heavily redacted financial disclosures, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. They were completely blind to the reality of their situation. Harrison thought he was about to engage in a battle of wits with corporate strangers. He thought he could use his status as a prominent black businessman to guilt a faceless corporation into giving him a second chance. He was completely unprepared for the fact that the person holding the axe was the exact same woman he had publicly discarded at a Georgetown restaurant just days ago. I placed my hand on the cool metal handle of the conference room door, taking one final breath before stepping into the room to burn his kingdom to the ground. I pushed down on the heavy metal handle and let the glass door swing open. The hinges were perfectly silent as I stepped into the expansive conference room. My father, Harrison, was sitting near the middle of the long marble table, reviewing a stack of papers with his attorney, Richard. They both looked up at the sound of my heels clicking against the polished floor. Harrison frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows pulling together in a display of immediate irritation. He looked at my tailored white suit and then at my face, completely failing to process why his disappointing daughter was walking into a high-level corporate meeting. He assumed I was lost, or perhaps working as a low-level assistant who had been sent to deliver coffee. "Sloan, what on earth are you doing here?" Harrison barked, his voice echoing in the large room. "This is a secure floor and a highly confidential meeting. You cannot just wander in here and embarrass me in front of my legal counsel. Go back down to the lobby and wait until I am finished conducting actual business." I did not respond to his commands. I walked deliberately past him, my eyes fixed on the massive leather chair at the very head of the table. The chair reserved strictly for the managing partner. I pulled it out and sat down, resting my hands on the cool black marble. I placed the single red folder directly in front of me. Harrison stood up, his face flushing with immediate anger. His pride could not handle the perceived disrespect. "I told you to leave," he demanded, slamming his hand flat against the table. "This is not a game, Sloan. I am here to meet with the executive board of Capital Vanguard Partners regarding a multi-million-dollar portfolio restructuring. Get out of that chair right now and go fetch your boss, before I have security escort you out of the building." Richard, the seasoned corporate attorney, had not spoken a word. Unlike my father, Richard was a man who paid attention to details. He noticed the tailored precision of my suit. He noticed the way I carried myself with absolute authority. And most importantly, his eyes locked onto the gold lettering embossed on the cover of the red folder I had just placed on the table. The folder that contained the entire financial autopsy of Harrison's crumbling empire. I leaned back in the executive chair, folding my hands together. "I am not fetching anyone, Harrison," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "And as for security, they work for me. So I highly suggest you sit back down and open the preliminary documents my assistant placed in front of you." Harrison's face turned a dark shade of crimson. His anger was boiling over rapidly, replacing his arrogant facade. He turned to his lawyer, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Richard, I apologize for this ridiculous interruption," Harrison sputtered. "This is my estranged daughter. She clearly has some sort of mental issue and works in a lower department here. Please contact reception and have her removed immediately so we can speak to the senior partners." But Richard did not reach for his phone. The attorney was staring at the documents in front of him, his face draining of all color. He looked from the papers to me and then back to the papers. His hands began to tremble slightly as he connected the dots that my father was too blinded by ego to see. "Richard, tell her to leave," Harrison ordered again, his voice rising in panic and fury. Richard slowly looked up at my father, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute defeat. He swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice in the freezing atmosphere of the conference room. "Mr. Harrison," Richard stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, you need to sit down." "I am not sitting down until she leaves," Harrison shouted, leaning over the table. "I demand to see the managing partner right now." "Harrison, please," Richard pleaded, tugging weakly at my father's tailored sleeve. You do not understand. She is not an assistant. The lawyer took a shaky breath, avoiding my gaze as he delivered the fatal blow to my father's massive ego. Sir, she is the boss. She is Sloan, the managing partner of Capital Vanguard. She is the sole proprietor of the debt portfolio. She is our creditor. The words hung in the air, suspended in the absolute silence of the room. Harrison froze his body, locking up as the sheer impossibility of the statement collided with his reality. He looked at Richard, searching the lawyer's face for any sign that this was a sick joke. But Richard only looked down at the table, completely defeated. Harrison slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant titan of real estate, the man who had demanded perfection from his family, and discarded me for failing to meet his standards, was suddenly looking at the grim reaper of his financial existence. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and he slowly sank back into his chair, staring at me as if he were looking at a ghost. I did not offer him a comforting smile. I did not gloat or raise my voice to celebrate my victory. I simply opened the red folder and looked down at the first page of his total liquidation. Now that we have established exactly who is running this meeting, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Let us discuss the immediate surrender of your entire fraudulent empire. You owe me $15 million. Harrison and I am here to collect every single cent. I reached into the red folder and pulled out a thick stack of heavily redacted bank statements and internal ledgers. I did not hand them to him gently. I tossed them across the slick marble surface of the table, watching them slide and fan out right in front of his shaking hands. Take a good look at page 4, I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face. That is the commercial property on M Street. The one you told the country club you were renovating into a luxury retail space. According to these records, you took out a commercial construction loan of $3.2 million against that property. But not a single contractor was ever hired. Not a single permit was ever filed with the city. Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked down at the highlighted numbers, but he could not bring himself to read them out loud. His lawyer, Richard, leaned in to inspect the documents, the color continuing to drain from his face with every line he read. I will tell you where that $3.2 million went, I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet room. $700,000 was wired directly to Vivian's personal accounts to cover her mounting debts at the designer boutiques in Paris and Milan. Another $400,000 was used to pay off the quiet settlement from your last tax evasion scare, and a staggering $1.5 million was funneled into Aelia's public relations firm disguised as a corporate retainer fee. You were paying your own daughter $1.5 million to handle the public relations for an empty concrete box. That is not what happened. Harrison managed to choke out, his voice weak and completely stripped of its usual booming authority. It was a temporary reallocation of funds, a bridge loan to keep the family ecosystem functioning during a market dip. You do not understand the complexities of real estate development, Sloan. I let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a laugh entirely devoid of amusement. I understand the complexities of federal fraud, Harrison. You cross-collateralized properties that were already underwater. You lied on your loan origination documents, inflating your projected rental income by 400%. And when traditional banks stopped taking your calls, you went to shadow lenders offering personal guarantees you could never back up. I pulled another document from the folder and slid it toward Richard. The lawyer picked it up, his hands trembling so badly the paper rustled in the quiet room. Read the covenant default clause to your client, I ordered the lawyer. Tell him exactly what he signed when he took that last loan of $5 million to fund Trent's fake tech startup. Richard adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat nervously. Mr. Harrison, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. The Uniform Commercial Code filings on these loans are ironclad. They include a sweeping cross-default provision. Because you missed the balloon payment last month, Capital Vanguard Partners has the legal right to accelerate all outstanding debts immediately. They also hold perfected security interests in all your holding companies. Harrison stared at his lawyer, his mouth hanging slightly open. Speak English. Richard, what does that mean? It means she owns everything, Richard replied, looking down at his polished shoes. The corporate accounts, the commercial deeds, the holding companies, and the personal guarantees. Mr. Harrison, you put up your primary residence as collateral. She holds the deed to your house. The reality of those words hit Harrison like a physical blow. The arrogant titan of real estate collapsed inward, his broad shoulders slumping against the leather chair. The mansion in Maryland. The one my mother Vivian used to host her exclusive society brunches, the one they used as a fortress of their fake elite status, was officially my property. I did not stop there. I was entirely merciless. I pulled out the final stack of ledgers and spread them out for him to see the complete autopsy of his failures. For years, you sat at the head of every dinner table and lectured me about success. I said my words hitting him like rhythmic strikes. You told me I lacked vision. You told me I was a disappointment because I chose to build my own career instead of begging for a position in your crumbling empire. While you were busy playing the wealthy patriarch, you were secretly bleeding your own companies dry to buy your golden child a fake reputation. Harrison closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples. His breathing was shallow and erratic. The illusion was completely shattered. The numbers on the table could not be manipulated or charmed away. They were cold, hard facts. Your total outstanding debt is $15,420,000, I stated, reading the exact figure from the master ledger. The interest is compounding daily at a default penalty rate of 18%. Your operating accounts are frozen. Your payroll is suspended. Aelia's firm has already been locked out of her building, and your residential estate is currently in the final stages of asset seizure. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble table, crossing my hands. I looked at the man who had allowed his wife to tell me I was unloved just a few nights ago. I looked at the man who had stolen my college fund to pamper the sister who mocked me. There is no bridge loan that can save you now, Harrison. There is no country club friend who can bail you out of this. The shadow lenders you borrowed from do not care about your legacy, and neither do I. You are financially ruined, and every single secret you have been hiding from the district is sitting right here in this red folder. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harrison stared at the glossy wood of the conference table, the weight of his absolute destruction crushing the last remnants of his pride. The boardroom, which he thought would be the stage for his masterful negotiation, had become his tomb. I watched him process the inescapable truth. He had always believed that his manipulation of money was an art form that only he understood. He thought his creative accounting was a sign of his superior intellect. But looking at the forensic breakdown I had prepared, he finally realized how sloppy and desperate his actions had actually been. You used my stolen college fund to make the first payment on Aelia's office lease, I added quietly, twisting the knife one last time. I traced that transfer too. You took the money my grandmother left for my education, and you washed it through a dummy corporation just to buy your favorite daughter a glass corner office. You thought I would never find out because you assumed I was not smart enough to understand a basic ledger. You assumed I would just disappear into the background and accept the life of a failure that you and Vivian assigned to me. Harrison slowly opened his eyes. They were red and filled with a sudden, terrified realization. He looked at me not as his disappointing daughter, but as the executioner holding the blade over his neck. The numbers laid out before him were an undeniable confession of his crimes, and he knew that I had the power to not just bankrupt him, but to send him to federal prison. Harrison stared at the documents for a long time before the reality finally broke him. The stiff posture that had defined his entire public life completely collapsed. His shoulders shook, and the man who had terrified me throughout my childhood suddenly looked incredibly small and pathetic. He reached up and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his hand trembling so violently he could barely lower it back to the marble table. Richard. His attorney sat frozen, clearly wanting to be anywhere else but in this room. Harrison leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a pleading gesture. Sloan, he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. You cannot do this. You are my daughter. I watched a single tear escape his eye and roll down his cheek. It was a performance worthy of an award, but I felt absolutely nothing. Please, Sloane. He continued, his voice growing thick with manufactured grief. We are blood. I am your father. I raised you. I put a roof over your head and food on your table. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to federal prison. You cannot take the family home from your mother. We are a family. Family forgives. I let his words hang in the freezing air of the conference room. He was doing exactly what abusers do when they are finally cornered. They weaponize the very relationship they spent years destroying. He wanted me to suddenly care about a familial bond that he had neglected and weaponized for 3 decades. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, perfectly mirroring his posture, but with none of his weakness. You raised me, Harrison. I asked, my tone completely flat. You put a roof over my head. That is the bare minimum legal requirement of a parent. You do not get a medal for keeping your child alive while simultaneously destroying her self-worth. Do you remember when I was 18? I asked him, keeping my eyes locked on his tear-stained face. I had just gotten accepted into a highly competitive finance program. I came to your home office asking for help with the tuition. You sat behind your massive desk and told me that women in our family do not belong in finance. You told me that my role was to find a wealthy husband and look pretty at country club dinners, just like Vivian. You told me that investing in my education was a waste of capital, because Aaliyah was the only one with real business sense. You drained my grandmother's trust fund to pay for Aaliyah's fake luxury life, and you let me work 3 separate minimum wage jobs just to afford my textbooks. I slept 4 hours a night. I rode the city bus in the dead of winter while you bought Trent a new Porsche for his birthday. You did not act like my father then. You acted like a tyrant who only valued people he could control. Harrison shook his head, tears now freely falling down his cheeks. I was wrong, Sloane, he sobbed. I made mistakes. But we can fix this. We can be a real family now. I will give you a seat on my board. We can run the empire together. Just drop these foreclosure notices and we can start over. I looked at him with profound pity. There is no empire left to run, Harrison. You burned it down. And as for being a family, you severed that tie permanently just a few nights ago. Do you remember my birthday dinner? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you remember sitting at that expensive table in Georgetown, drinking vintage champagne, while your wife stood up and humiliated me in front of your high society friends? You sat there and smiled while she told me that I was a massive disappointment. And then she said the truest thing she has ever spoken. She said, let me be honest, we never loved you. Harrison opened his mouth to protest, to claim he did not agree with her, but I cut him off. You did not say a word to defend me, Harrison. Your silence was your endorsement. You agreed with every single cruel syllable that came out of her mouth. So I am going to take her word for it. I tapped the red folder on the table. You do not get to play the family card when you are staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. You lost the right to call me your daughter the moment you stole my future to fund your lies. You told me you never loved me. Well, in business, when there is no love, we only speak through contracts. And the contracts on this table dictate that I own you completely. I slid the final stack of thick legal documents across the smooth marble surface, stopping them right at the edge of his trembling fingertips. These are the terms of your surrender, Harrison. I announced, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You are going to sign these papers right now and file for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy. You are going to immediately transfer the deeds to the Maryland estate and Aaliyah's commercial office space directly to Capital Vanguard. You are also going to sign over every remaining liquid asset in your shell companies to satisfy the default penalties. Harrison stared at the thick stack of paper as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. He recoiled slightly, shaking his head in a desperate denial of his reality. You want to take my home? He gasped, his chest heaving. You want to put your mother out on the street and shut down your sister's business. You want to leave us with absolutely nothing. I already told you, I replied, leaning back into my leather chair. Vivian is not my mother, and Aelia is not my sister. They are simply occupants residing in properties that I now legally own. And yes, I am taking it all because you bought it all with stolen money. My stolen money. Harrison turned wildly to his attorney. Richard, grabbing the man's sleeve. Richard, do something, he pleaded. File an injunction. Claim financial duress. Tell her we need time to review the terms. We cannot just sign away my entire life in a single afternoon. Richard gently but firmly pulled his arm away from Harrison's grasp. The seasoned lawyer looked down at the table, his professional demeanor completely shattered by the sheer volume of evidence I had presented. Mr. Harrison, Richard said, his voice strained and heavy, she has you dead to rights. If you fight this in civil court, she will freeze whatever you have left during the litigation. But that is not the real problem, sir. Richard pointed a shaking finger at the red folder containing the money laundering evidence. If you do not sign her settlement agreement right now, she is going to hand that folder over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have seen the wire transfers and the fake invoices. It is textbook wire fraud and tax evasion. If this goes to the feds, you are not just losing the house. You are going to spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary. I strongly advise you to sign the papers. Harrison's eyes darted around the glass-walled conference room like a trapped animal looking for an exit that did not exist. His breathing was loud and ragged. The great patriarch, the man who had controlled his family with an iron fist and ruthless financial manipulation, was completely out of options. His own lawyer had just read him his last rites. You have a choice to make, Harrison, I said, picking up a heavy gold-plated pen from the center console and sliding it toward him. You can sign everything over to me today and walk out of this building as a free man, albeit a completely broke one. Or you can refuse, and I will hit send on the email I have already drafted to the White Collar Crimes Division. The FBI will raid your offices before dinner time. They will seize the mansion anyway, and you will be arrested in front of all those country club friends Vivian cares so much about. He looked at the gold pen. It gleamed under the recessed lighting of the boardroom. It was the instrument of his total destruction. Please, Sloane, he whimpered one last time, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. I am an old man. Do not do this to me. I checked my watch, completely unmoved by his tears. You have exactly 60 seconds to pick up that pen before the offer expires and I make the call. He stared at me, searching my face for any hint of mercy, any lingering trace of the desperate little girl who used to crave his approval. He found nothing but a hardened executive who had learned the rules of the game from the very man she was now destroying. Realizing that his tears were entirely useless, he slowly reached out and picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently that the first signature was a jagged, illegible scrawl. He paused, taking a ragged breath before moving to the next page. The only sound in the massive room was the scratching of the pen against the paper, and the quiet sobs of a ruined man. Page after page, he signed away the empire he had built on lies. He signed away the mansion where I was made to feel like an outsider. He signed away the corporate entity that had funded Aelia's arrogant lifestyle. He signed away his pride, his legacy, and his entire identity. When he reached the final page, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before pressing the pen down hard and completing the transfer. The pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the marble table. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with absolute despair. I smoothly pulled the documents toward me, checking each signature line with precise efficiency. Everything was in order. The bankruptcy declarations, the asset transfers, the complete and total surrender. The transaction was finalized. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Harrison, I said, maintaining my professional corporate tone. Your access to all company accounts has been revoked. My asset management team will be arriving at the Maryland estate at 9 a.m. tomorrow to begin the appraisal and eviction process. I suggest you use the remaining hours of your freedom to pack whatever personal items you can fit into a single suitcase. I stood up from the managing partner's chair, holding the signed documents securely in my hands. "The meeting is adjourned," I announced. "You and your counsel will be escorted out of the building." Harrison did not look up. He remained hunched over the table, a broken shell of a man who had finally met the consequences of his own cruelty. I did not wait for him to gather himself. I turned and walked out of the glass doors, leaving him behind in the cold, sterile boardroom. The heavy doors closed behind me, sealing his fate and securing my absolute freedom. The morning sun had barely crested over the Potomac River when my asset recovery teams deployed across the district and the surrounding Maryland suburbs. I stood by the wall of windows in my penthouse, holding a mug of dark coffee, watching the city wake up. I had coordinated the logistics with military precision. There would be no quiet warnings and no discreet transitions. My family had always craved public attention, and I was about to give them the most heavily spectated downfall in recent history. At exactly 9 in the morning, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the iron gates of the sprawling Maryland estate that my mother Vivian had treated as her personal kingdom. The private security contractors hired by Capital Vanguard did not buzz the intercom. They bypassed the electronic lock using the legal authority granted by the bankruptcy court and the asset seizure documents Harrison had signed less than 24 hours ago. The heavy iron gates swung open and the vehicles crawled up the manicured driveway. My mother was hosting her weekly morning tennis committee meeting on the back patio. According to the incident report filed later by my lead recovery agent, she was wearing a crisp white tennis skirt and holding a crystal flute of orange juice, holding court among 4 very wealthy, very gossipy politicians' wives. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently trespassing on my property. The lead agent, flanked by 2 uniformed county sheriffs, walked directly onto the patio. They did not wait for an invitation. The agent politely but firmly informed Vivian that the property was now under the receivership of Capital Vanguard Partners. He handed her a thick packet of eviction documents outlining that she had until sundown to pack her personal clothing and vacate the premises. Anything left behind, including the imported furniture, the expensive art collection, and the luxury vehicles parked in the garage, now belonged to the firm to satisfy the default penalties. Vivian dropped her crystal glass. It shattered against the stone patio. She tried to scream at the men, demanding they leave, threatening to call the police, completely ignoring the fact that the police were already standing right there, facilitating her removal. The tennis committee women immediately gathered their designer bags and fled to their cars, pretending not to look back, but undoubtedly texting every person in their social circle before they even reached the end of the driveway. The most devastating blow to Vivian's ego came 10 minutes later. A contractor drove a heavy wooden stake into the perfectly manicured grass, directly adjacent to the street facing iron gates. Attached to the stake was a bright neon sign that read, "Foreclosed and seized by Capital Vanguard." It was impossible to miss. Every neighbor, every country club associate, and every passing car could see that the mighty house of Harrison had fallen. My mother was forced to carry trash bags filled with her clothing down the driveway, while passing drivers slowed down to stare. Across the city, a similar scene was unfolding at the commercial building that housed Aaliyah's public relations firm. Aaliyah had shown up to work early, desperately trying to conduct damage control from the humiliating subpoena incident at her launch party. She had ordered her remaining staff to lock the front doors and ignore all incoming calls. She thought she could simply hide behind the frosted glass until her father fixed the problem. But her father had surrendered, and there was no one left to fix anything. A commercial locksmith, accompanied by my corporate legal team, arrived at the building at 9:15. They did not bother knocking. The locksmith simply drilled out the cylinder of the main entrance lock and replaced it within 2 minutes. My legal team stepped inside, carrying the master lease agreements that Harrison had signed over. Aaliyah rushed out of her corner office, her face flushed with panic and anger. She started screaming about trespassing and calling her lawyers. But my lead attorney simply handed her the signed forfeiture documents. He explained in a very calm, very bored voice that the lease had been terminated due to extreme delinquency and fraudulent funding. He told her that the computer servers, the staging furniture, and the expensive espresso machines were now corporate assets. My sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me, was given exactly 15 minutes to gather her personal belongings. She had to walk past her own bewildered employees, carrying a cardboard box filled with desk trinkets and a few framed photos. Her employees were handed severance packets from my firm and told to go home. Ilea was escorted out of the building by security and forced to stand on the crowded downtown sidewalk, while a heavy metal chain and padlock were secured around the glass door handles of her former empire. The social fallout was instantaneous and absolute. The black elite of Washington, D.C. is a tight-knit circle that values discretion and genuine wealth above all else. They tolerate arrogance only when it is backed by actual power. But the moment the smell of federal fraud and bankruptcy hits the air, the community acts like an immune system violently rejecting a virus. By noon, Vivian's name was quietly but permanently scrubbed from the steering committee of the annual charity gala. The country club management, citing the public disturbance of her asset seizure, sent a courier to her temporary hotel room to politely inform her that her membership had been suspended, pending a board review that would never actually happen. The church elders who had happily eaten her catered food just weeks prior suddenly stopped returning her frantic phone calls. Aliyah suffered an even swifter professional death. The local politicians and minor celebrities she had counted on her client roster sent immediate termination notices. No one wanted their public image managed by a woman who had been physically locked out of her own office for failing to pay rent with stolen money. The influencers who had been at her party were now posting long, thoughtful videos about how they were shocked and saddened by her deceptive business practices, using her downfall to generate sympathy views for themselves. Harrison fared the worst of all. His commercial real estate buddies, the men he golfed with and traded insider tips with, completely ghosted him. When you sign away $15 million to avoid a federal indictment, word travels fast through the financial district. He was radioactive. His bank accounts were frozen. His credit score was utterly decimated, and his reputation was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. They had spent 32 years building a fortress of lies, trying to keep me locked outside in the cold. They had used stolen money to paint a picture of perfection. And in less than 24 hours, I had stripped away the paint, demolished the walls, and left them standing completely naked in front of the entire world. They had absolutely nothing left to their names except the clothes on their backs and the overwhelming realization that the daughter they never loved was the one who pulled the trigger. I sat at my desk watching the reports roll in from my field agents. Every single objective had been met with zero resistance. Julian walked into my office and placed a hand on my shoulder, looking at the digital dashboard tracking the property seizures. "It is completely finished," he said softly. "They are officially locked out of the elite society they worshipped." I nodded, feeling a deep settling calm in my chest. The dominoes had not just fallen, they had pulverized the table they were sitting on. But there was still one loose end, frantically trying to sever his ties to the sinking ship. Trent, the arrogant tech bro, who thought he could mansplain his way out of federal fraud, was about to learn that rats who flee a sinking ship usually just drown in the ocean anyway. Trent had spent his entire marriage to my sister playing the role of the visionary entrepreneur. He loved to stand at family gatherings, swirling a glass of expensive scotch and talking endlessly about disruption and innovation. But the only thing he had ever successfully disrupted was my father's bank account. When he ran out of my lobby a few days ago, sweating and pale after I showed him the money laundering files, he knew his free ride was over. He knew that Harrison was completely compromised and that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was just one email away. Rats do not possess a sense of loyalty, and Trent was the ultimate rat. He did not care that Aelia was his wife or that she had spent years defending his failures to everyone in her social circle. He only cared about self-preservation. My security team had been monitoring their luxury condo downtown. It was a gorgeous property with floor-to-ceiling windows that Harrison had secured for them using a fraudulent corporate lease. Around 2 in the afternoon, just hours after Aaliyah had been publicly evicted from her office building, Trent arrived at the condo. He did not go there to comfort his wife. He went there to strip the place bare. According to the lobby security footage that my team acquired, Trent brought a team of private movers. He bypassed the shared assets and went straight for high-value items that he could easily liquidate. He packed his imported watches, his custom-tailored suits, and the expensive electronics that Aaliyah had purchased for him, using her fake public relations budget. He moved with frantic, desperate energy, shoving his belongings into designer luggage while constantly checking his phone. He was terrified that federal agents were going to kick the door down at any second. Aaliyah arrived at the condo shortly after 3. She was still reeling from the devastating public humiliation of being locked out of her business. She had lost her company, her reputation, and her social standing, all in the span of a single morning. She was completely shattered. She likely walked into that condo expecting her perfect husband to wrap his arms around her to tell her that they would rebuild and that he would finally step up and take care of her. Instead, she walked into a disaster zone. She found Trent zipping up his final suitcase near the front door. I can only imagine the sheer shock that washed over her. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable was suddenly standing in the middle of a collapsing marriage. She probably asked him what he was doing, assuming he was packing for a sudden business trip. But Trent did not offer her any comforting lies. He did not have to pretend anymore because the Bank of Harrison was officially closed. Trent looked at the woman he had sworn to love and protect, and he handed her a manila folder. It contained hastily drafted divorce papers. He had called his lawyer the minute he left my building days ago, knowing that the money laundering trail would eventually lead to him if he stayed connected to the Wilson family. He needed to legally sever ties with Aaliyah to protect himself from the impending federal indictments. He did not offer her sympathy. He told her exactly what she had become to him, a massive liability. He explained that his lawyers advised him to distance himself from her family's toxic financial situation. He blamed her and Harrison for dragging him into a criminal enterprise, completely ignoring the fact that he was the one generating the fake invoices to wash the money. He gaslighted her in her most vulnerable moment, leaving her standing in the foyer with a stack of divorce papers and zero explanations for how she was going to survive. Trent walked out the door dragging his luggage behind him and left Aaliyah completely alone. The perfect marriage that she had flaunted on social media, the relationship my mother had constantly compared me against, dissolved in less than 5 minutes. Trent took an Uber straight to Dulles International Airport and boarded a flight to California to hide out at his parents' house, leaving his wife to face the wreckage of their fraudulent life by herself. When my lead investigator brought me the report later that afternoon, I read through it while sitting on the velvet sofa in my office. I felt no pity for my sister. For years, Aaliyah had allowed Trent to make passive-aggressive comments about my career and my lifestyle. She had sat beside him at dinner tables, smiling proudly while he mocked my independence. She had derived a sick sense of pleasure from feeling superior to me simply because she had a husband who wore expensive suits and drove a car my father paid for. She had built her entire identity around being the chosen daughter with the perfect life. She believed that because she followed my mother's shallow rules, she would always be protected. She believed that proximity to my father's money made her invincible. But money that is stolen cannot buy loyalty. It only rents parasites. Trent was a parasite who had finally sucked his host dry. The moment the blood supply was cut off, he detached himself and scurried away to find a new victim. Aaliyah was forced to sit in that empty condo, realizing that every single thing she bragged about was a complete lie. Her business was a fraud. Her parents' wealth was an illusion. And the husband she worshipped had only stuck around for the direct deposits. She had spent 32 years looking down on me for building my life brick by brick without a safety net. Now her safety net had been violently ripped away and she was falling fast. She had no money, no credit, no friends, and no husband. She had absolutely nothing left but the crushing realization that she was entirely unequipped to survive in the real world. The golden child was about to hit rock bottom, and I knew exactly where she would run to next. She would try to find the only person in the city who actually had real money. She was going to come crawling to me. The sun had fully set over the Potomac River, casting long dark shadows across the imported hardwood floors of my penthouse living room. Julian was in the study reviewing a legal brief for his firm, and I was pouring myself a glass of expensive red wine when the private intercom near the front entrance buzzed loudly. It was a harsh, unusual sound. My building had airtight security, and unannounced guests simply did not happen in this tier of luxury real estate. I walked over and pressed the silver button, listening to the concierge who sounded deeply apologetic. He explained that a frantic woman claiming to be my sister had slipped past the front desk during a brief shift change and managed to get into the private elevator bank before the guards could physically intercept her. He offered to send the armed security team up immediately to drag her off my floor. I took a slow sip of my wine, feeling the rich vintage warm my throat, and told him to stand down. I knew exactly why she was here, and I wanted to look her right in the eye when I ended this chapter of our lives completely. Seconds later, heavy, frantic pounding echoed against my custom mahogany front door. It was not the polite, measured knock of a society woman. It was the desperate hammering of a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. I did not rush to answer it. I set my wine glass down on the cool marble counter, walked slowly to the foyer, and pulled the heavy door open. The woman standing in my hallway was barely recognizable as the glowing, confident public relations CEO from the Georgetown dinner party just days ago. Aaliyah's perfect salon blowout was a frizzy, tangled mess hanging limply around her face. Her expensive designer mascara was smeared in dark, chaotic streaks down her cheeks. She was wearing the same silk blouse from yesterday, but it was wrinkled and stained with sweat and tears. The golden child of the Wilson family had been utterly shattered. She was shaking violently, clutching a single oversized leather tote bag against her chest that presumably held whatever valuables she could grab before Trent handed her divorce papers and locked her out of their fraudulent life. "Sloan, please," Aaliyah gasped, her voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. The absolute moment she saw my face. "You have to help me." Trent left me. He packed his bags and served me with divorce papers and took everything of value. The bank froze all my personal checking accounts because they were tied to Dad's holding company, and now my cards are declining everywhere. I have absolutely nowhere to go, Sloan. I do not have a single dollar to my name, and none of my friends are returning my calls. You have to let me stay here. You have to help me fix this. I leaned against the doorframe, blocking her path into my sanctuary. I looked at her tear-stained face, her trembling hands, and her ruined posture, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sisterly bond pulling at my heartstrings. There was no sudden urge to comfort her or invite her inside out of the cold. I was simply observing the natural, devastating consequences of 32 years of unchecked arrogance and entitlement coming home to roost. Aaliyah dropped to her knees right there in the carpeted hallway, completely abandoning whatever dignity she had left. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "It was Mom and Dad," she sobbed frantically, trying to shift the blame to save herself. "They manipulated me, Sloan. They told me the business was doing great and that we were untouchable. Dad lied to me about the lease for my office. He lied about where the funding came from. I did not know he stole your college trust fund to pay for my agency. I swear to God I did not know the money was yours. They made me act like that. They pitted us against each other so they could control us and keep up their perfect image. I am a victim in this too. You have to believe me. Just give me a job at your firm, Sloan. I will do anything. I will start at the very bottom, answering phones or bringing coffee. Just please do not leave me out on the street." I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. I let her desperate, pathetic pleas echo in the quiet hallway before I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried the crushing weight of absolute finality. "You are not a victim." "Aaliyah," I said, keeping my expression completely devoid of sympathy. Do not insult my intelligence by blaming mom and dad for your own cruelty. They might have created the toxic environment in our house, but you happily thrived in it. You did not just go along with their behavior to survive. You weaponized it for your own amusement. You knew exactly what you were doing when you paraded your fake success around while mocking my career. I continued, not letting her interrupt. You knew exactly what you were doing when you stood by and laughed while mom told me I was unloved at my own birthday dinner. You actively participated in my humiliation every single day because making me feel small was the only way you could feel big. You never once questioned where the money for your luxury firm came from because you felt entirely entitled to it. You enjoyed their cruelty toward me for 32 years because it secured your permanent spot on the pedestal. You loved watching me suffer. Aaliyah stared up at me, her mouth trembling as her cowardly excuses evaporated against the cold, hard truth of my words. She reached out a shaking hand, trying to grab the hem of my tailored trousers to pull herself up. I took a deliberate step backward, retreating entirely into the safety of my own home and out of her reach. Nobody is coming to save you. Aaliyah, I told her, watching her fresh tears fall onto the hallway carpet. The Bank of Harrison is permanently closed. Your fake husband is gone. And the sister you spent your entire life mocking is the one who holds the deed to your total ruin. You have spent 3 decades feeding off the destruction of my self-worth while pretending you were superior. Now learn how to survive on your own. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or beg for another unearned chance. I reached for the heavy mahogany door and began to swing it shut. Aaliyah let out a gut-wrenching scream of pure desperation, lunging forward to try and stop the door from closing. But I was faster and far more resolute. The heavy wood clicked shut with a resounding thud, engaging the automatic deadbolt and severing the physical connection between us forever. I stood in my foyer for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of her sobbing and pounding her fists against the other side of the heavy door. I calmly picked up my wineglass from the marble counter, took a slow, appreciative sip, and walked back into the living room, leaving the golden child to face the crushing reality of the real world entirely by herself. The next few days passed with a quiet efficiency that only absolute corporate victory can bring. The foreclosure on the Maryland estate had been fully executed and the locks were changed. Harrison was officially bankrupt and Aaliyah had disappeared into the anonymity of a cheap motel after Trent finalized their divorce filings. There was only one loose end left to tie up and she found me before I even had to look for her. It was late Thursday evening when my private driver dropped me off at the secure underground parking garage of my office building. The concrete cavern was usually empty and heavily monitored by my security team, but somehow my mother, Vivian, had managed to slip past the outer perimeter. She was waiting for me in the shadows near my reserved parking spot, standing next to a concrete pillar like a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own life. I stepped out of the back of my car and paused. The woman standing before me was completely unrecognizable as the reigning queen of the local country club. Vivian was not wearing a tailored pastel suit or a silk designer dress. She was wearing a simple faded trench coat and flat shoes. Her signature flawless blowout was pulled back into a messy bun, revealing the gray roots she had spent thousands of dollars hiding for decades. Her face was devoid of makeup, making her look incredibly aged and fragile. The heavy bags under her eyes told the story of sleepless nights and shattered illusions. "Sloan!" she called out, her voice echoing thinly in the empty garage. Her tone was not commanding or sweet. It was desperate and raw. "Please do not call security. I just need 5 minutes. I waited for you here because they will not let me pass the lobby anymore." I did not flinch or reach for my phone. I simply stood by my car, gesturing for my driver to wait inside the vehicle. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked at the woman who had birthed me, watching her tremble in the damp air of the parking garage. "You have exactly 5 minutes, Vivian," I said, my voice perfectly flat, echoing her own previous coldness. "Make them count." She took a tentative step forward, clasping her bare hands together. She did not have her massive diamond ring anymore. The bank had likely seized it along with the estate. She looked up at me with pleading eyes, attempting to summon the matriarchal authority that had died the moment I bought their debt. You have made your point, Sloane. Vivian began, her voice wavering as she hugged her coat tighter around her shivering frame. You showed us how powerful you are, and how much we underestimated you. You took the house and you humiliated us in front of the entire district. Your father is facing federal charges, and Aliyah has nothing left. We are completely ruined. Is that not enough for you? Are you not satisfied yet? I stared at her, completely unmoved by her tears. I am highly satisfied, Vivian. The liquidation is proceeding perfectly on schedule. She gasped, stepping closer, her desperation giving way to a frantic, manipulative energy. You cannot let this continue, she begged, grabbing the sleeve of my coat. You have to call off the asset seizures and the federal investigators. Sloane, you are destroying a prominent Black family. Do you have any idea what they are saying about us at the church and the country club? We were pillars of this community. We represented Black excellence and generational wealth. You are letting the whole world watch us fall apart. Think about our legacy. Think about the honor of our family name. You cannot just erase everything we built. She was still playing the same tired game. Even now, stripped of her mansion and her money, she was entirely obsessed with how she looked to other people. She did not care about the emotional damage she had inflicted on me for 32 years. She only cared about the gossip circling the very society women who had immediately turned their backs on her. She was trying to use racial solidarity and elite social standing as a shield against federal fraud. She actually believed that, because we were a prominent Black family, the rules of basic decency and corporate law did not apply to her. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away from her grasp, smoothing down the fabric of my coat. I looked at her with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Honor, I repeated, letting the word hang heavily in the cold air of the garage. You have the absolute audacity to stand here and talk to me about honor and family legacy. Vivian shrank back slightly, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Yes, our honor, she whispered. We are a family, Sloane. You are tearing down your own blood. I took a step toward her, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. The legacy you are crying over was entirely fake, Vivian, I told her, my voice echoing sharply against the concrete walls. You did not build Black excellence. Harrison built a house of cards using predatory loans and fake invoices. You paraded around in designer clothes bought with stolen money while telling me I was a disappointment for actually working for a living. You used my stolen college fund to prop up Aaliyah's fake business just so you could brag about her at your little brunches. You funded your entire social life by defrauding investors and washing money through Trent's garbage tech company. She opened her mouth to protest, but I did not give her the space to breathe. And as for honor, I continued, stepping even closer until she was pinned against the concrete pillar. Honor is not found in a country club membership, Mother. It is not found in sitting at a private table in Georgetown, drinking vintage champagne and pretending to be better than everyone else. It is not found in driving an imported car or wearing a diamond ring paid for by a shadow lender. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, unable to face the absolute truth of my words. She was physically shaking now, her entire worldview collapsing under the weight of her own hypocrisy. Honor is found in not betraying your own child, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. Honor is protecting your daughter instead of standing up at her birthday dinner and telling a room full of strangers that you never loved her. Honor is supporting your child when she works 3 jobs to survive instead of mocking her from a mansion built on fraud. You cut that tie yourself, Vivian. You severed the bloodline the moment you decided my worth was based solely on how I made you look to your shallow friends. I am your mother, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, letting out a pathetic wail that echoed through the parking garage. You cannot just throw me away like I am nothing. I did not throw you away, I replied, stepping back and adjusting my briefcase. I simply foreclosed on a bad investment. You are nothing more than a defaulted asset now. The FBI will be contacting you shortly regarding your involvement in Harrison's money laundering. I suggest you use whatever loose change you have left to hire a public defender because your country club friends are certainly not going to post your bail. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing against the cold concrete pillar. I walked toward the private elevator that would take me up to my corner office. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not feel a single ounce of regret or lingering sadness. The woman crying in the garage was a stranger who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. Today, I had finally shown her exactly how small she really was. The elevator doors slid open and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor, ascending into the bright and brilliant life I had built entirely on my own. 6 months passed since the elevator doors closed on my past, and the dust from the collapse of the Wilson Empire finally settled over the district. The federal investigations swept through Harrison's remaining shell companies like a hurricane, leaving absolutely nothing but scorched earth and heavy tax liens in their wake. My legal team had handed over every single ledger and wire transfer document, perfectly wrapping up a case that the IRS and FBI pursued with ruthless efficiency. Harrison managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by cooperating fully with the federal authorities and liquidating whatever hidden offshore accounts he had left to pay massive fines. But his freedom came at a humiliating price. The man who once strutted through boardrooms acting like a king was now working a low-level administrative consulting job at a mid-sized logistics firm. His wages were aggressively garnished by the government. There were no more tailored pinstripe suits, no more imported cigars, and no more expensive golf outings. He sat in a cramped cubicle pushing papers for a manager half his age, looking tired and entirely broken. The empire he built on lies and stolen funds was gone forever. Vivian's reality was equally devastating. The sprawling Maryland estate with its manicured lawns and private tennis courts was sold at auction by my firm. She was forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood far outside the wealthy bubble of the capital. Her transition was brutal. The society women she had desperately tried to impress the country club members and the church elders completely ostracized her. When she walked down the street, no one recognized the former matriarch of Black elite society. She had no designer clothes left to hide behind, and no wealth to buy her way into exclusive circles. She spent her days sitting in her cramped living room, staring at the walls, completely isolated by her own toxic pride. Aaliyah suffered perhaps the most poetic justice of all. Stripped of her fake public relations agency and abandoned by her white savior husband, she had to face the reality of surviving without a safety net. The golden child who had mocked my work ethic and bragged about her luxurious lifestyle was forced to apply for entry-level jobs. She ended up working as a retail sales associate at a high-end department store in Georgetown, the exact same store where she used to spend thousands of dollars of stolen money on designer handbags. She spent her days on her feet folding sweaters and fetching shoes for the very same wealthy women she used to invite to her fake launch parties. She had to swallow her enormous ego every single time she swiped a customer's credit card, answering to a store manager who was 5 years younger than her. While they lived out the miserable consequences of their actions, I was busy building a life of absolute peace and undeniable purpose. On a warm Saturday evening in early spring, Julian and I hosted an intimate dinner party at our penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows were open, letting in the soft breeze from the Potomac River. The dining table was not filled with fake society friends or toxic family members. It was surrounded by our genuine circle of supporters, my brilliant legal team, my trusted business partners, and the friends who had respected me long before they knew I was a millionaire. Julian stood up and tapped his crystal glass, capturing the attention of the room. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound, deep love that required no performance and no conditions. He raised his glass and proposed a toast to my resilience, to our recent engagement, and to the beautiful future we were building together entirely on our own terms. I smiled, raising my glass in return, feeling a warmth in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with true freedom. But I was not just celebrating my personal victory. Earlier that week, I had taken a significant portion of the assets I recovered from Harrison's liquidated portfolio and established a massive charitable foundation. I called it the Vanguard Initiative. It was a multi-million-dollar scholarship and mentorship program specifically designed for underprivileged Black women pursuing degrees in finance, economics, and STEM fields. My parents had stolen my college fund to pamper their golden child and tried to tell me that women in our family did not belong in the financial sector. I took their stolen money and used it to fully fund the tuitions of 50 brilliant, driven young women who would go on to disrupt the very industry my father had failed in. I turned their legacy of financial abuse into a vehicle for genuine generational upliftment. As I stood on the terrace of my penthouse later that night, looking out over the glittering lights of the Capitol, I realized something incredibly important. The sweetest revenge you can ever achieve against a toxic family is not just destroying their fake empires or exposing their lies. It is not about watching them lose their mansions or their social status. The ultimate revenge is becoming undeniably successful, entirely unreachable, and wildly happy without them. It is waking up every single morning knowing that your worth is not defined by people who were too blind to see your potential. It is stepping out of the shadows they forced you into and shining so brightly that they can no longer even look at you. If you ever find yourself holding the keys to your toxic family's destruction, and you have the power to take back everything they stole from you, never hesitate to turn the lock. Never let the illusion of blood ties force you to tolerate abuse. You owe them absolutely nothing but the consequences of their own actions. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have shown them mercy, or would you have liquidated their empire just like I did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If my story resonated with you and you love hearing about surviving toxic families and thriving against all odds, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that the best way to handle people who underestimate you is to buy the building they are standing in.